Well, good morning. Thanks to the organizers for organizing this conference and giving me the opportunity to speak here. Today I'd like to tell you about probabilistic programming, this data analysis tool, and the very readable code that this kind of methodology leads to. I'd also like to give you kind of a first-hand account of how this field has progressed over the last 2 decades. And it's been an interesting ride. I've been going back and forth between academia and industry a few times, trying to connect the theory from academia to real problems, and it's been interesting. So I started my career studying probability and math. I had this really great stats professor in one of the first classes I took in college, and then had the opportunity to join my master's advisor in a startup he had. And the entire startup was focused on Bayesian modeling, building probabilistic models for aircraft tracking. So that was around 2002, and around 2002, a probabilistic model usually meant like a probabilistic graphical model. Judea Pearl and Daphne Kohler and Kevin Murphy had popularized these probabilistic graphical models, or hierarchical Bayesian models, multi-level probabilistic models. They all kind of mean similar things. So let me explain what these are into detail. So the idea here is that we have probability distributions, like here there's a normal distribution and a log normal distribution, and we want to connect those together to build a more complex probabilistic model. Here we can write, Here we can write like mu being sampled from a normal, sigma being sampled from log normal x. There's like a math notation on the left, and there's this visual notation on the right. And crucially, these probability distributions are connected to each other, right? We can draw these arrows where the upstream random variables can be used as parameters of downstream random variables. And we can distinguish different types of random variables. There are these observed data. We can denote those as shaded nodes here, or hidden variables, or latent variables, they're sometimes called, are the things you don't know in a model. Okay? Another motif that occurs quite often in these probabilistic models is repeated nodes. We might have, we all have multiple, we observe data, right? We don't observe a datum, we have multiple observations. And that's a little cumbersome to write here, but people use this plate notation. They draw a box and they say how many times something was repeated. So it's a common, back in the 90s, early 2000s, it was a common way of describing these bigger models. So let me explain now try to explain why these probabilistic models are useful. I can't explain these any better than Andrew Gellman, so I'd recommend his great book, but let me just briefly mention some advantages of these kinds of models. One is that, in contrast, this model, you could have just computed like the mean and the standard deviation, right? Why didn't we just let mu be the mean of the x's, right, and sigma be the standard deviation? Why do we even have a probabilistic model? Why don't we just compute some moments here? Well, one reason is that we might not have much data. We might want to regularize our computations. And so we can add priors here, we can add prior knowledge and say, like, if I only have one data point, it's really difficult to compute the standard deviation, but I might want some prior, to add some prior information. If you have a lot of data, the prior gets washed out. It doesn't really matter. But if we have just a little bit of data, it's important to be able to add prior knowledge for regularization. These models are useful, obviously because we can deal with noisy data. Here I've used a normal distribution, but we might want different noise models. Often we adjust the tail behavior. Instead of a normal distribution, we will use a heavy tail distribution to handle outliers. But we can really tightly calibrate how we deal with noisy data. This framework of probabilistic modeling is great for fusing different types of data. For example, here we can make a slightly more complex probabilistic model that combines both real value data and integer discrete data that we observe, right? More generally, these models give a consistent semantic framework for fusing, say, like image or text, different types, different modalities of data in a clean way. These kinds of models define, the outputs of these models would be like estimates of these parameters, like mu and sigma, and they output an uncertainty, right? They can tell you if they don't know, if you don't have much data, or if your data doesn't tell you about a particular variable, these models can tell you, hey, you don't know these parameter estimates with very much certainty, or some parameters you might know with very high certainty. In the Bayesian framework, we call that a posterior distribution. The prior is the distribution over data prior to having any information, seeing any observations. And this posterior the posterior distribution is the narrower, typically narrower distribution after seeing, just post seeing data. And we write this in this funny notation, P of mu comma sigma, given, having seen this data X and Y. And finally, these are useful because it's not just a single distribution. They're really composable. Like deep learning models, you can compose all these layers together. Here, you can compose all these distributions together, and you can create really, really complex, detailed models. So this is what we were building at my advisor's startup back in 2002. He had an entire company based on using these Bayesian models for aircraft tracking. And this was 2002, and our process, we weren't using Python back then. We were writing a lot of LaTeX. We would write a model down in LaTeX. We would write an inference algorithm in LaTeX to infer things. We'd prototype the algorithm in MATLAB and make sure it works, and then we realize it doesn't work, and we change it, and then that doesn't work either, and after some iterations, it would finally work, and we'd try to speed it up in terms of asymptotics. And then once that was done, we would write a really high-speed implementation in optimized C++, right? And this took a long time, months and months. And one of the forward-thinking software engineers at this company back in 2002 suggested on a new project, why don't we try out this new thing, this thing called Python. This was before Python 2. This was like Python 1. And we were looking around for these there were libraries in this, back when we used C++, we were writing everything from scratch. Like, you couldn't just import things, you couldn't pip install things in C++. Everything was from scratch. And it was pretty cool in Python because there were these libraries like numeric and numerate. These were predecessors of NumPy. And they were still not quite mature, so we ended up not using these libraries for the project. We ended up still writing C++ because we were used to that. But then we would wrap it in Swig or Boost Python. And that was a huge advancement, right? Because we were in Python, it was like an object-oriented language, it had a nice syntax, it was readable. We could have really performant low-level tools down low, and then work with these abstractions in Python, and it was way better than the LaTeX and MATLAB workflow. And Kevin Murphy, for example, had also been building these kind of modular frameworks in MATLAB. Python ended up being nicer than MATLAB just because it was an easier programming language to work with. But this library that we built really only worked with Gaussians, these multivariate normal distributions. They represented where we thought an airplane was or how fast it's going. They were these finite dimensional objects. And it turns out aircraft tracking is kind of a multiple target tracking in general is kind of this special class of statistics problems because you don't always know how many aircraft there are, okay? Often in statistics, you're trying to infer some distribution over a vector, right? Maybe it's a single variable, maybe it's like a 10-dimensional vector. In aircraft tracking, you don't know the length of the vector because you don't know how many things you're trying to track. It's like even if I was trying to track people or something, you don't know exactly how many there are, right? And these are called open world problems, and actually, it's really difficult to do this in this probabilistic graphical model framework. You can't have an unknown number of random variables. It just needs to be a fixed graph. And so people were thinking at the time, how can we generalize this? It's pretty is pretty confining. We wanted to generalize these methods. We had this nice, composable framework for doing inference, but we couldn't quite represent our entire problem. We could represent components of our problem using these nice methods, but not the whole problem. And so, a lot of people at the time were wondering, like, how can we generalize these things? Stuart Russell was doing research in kind of slight generalizations of graphical models, these open world modeling languages. But like, people were wondering, how far could we go? Like, what's the most general hypothesis space that you could think of? Sometimes people call these like non-parametric models, but I guess the most complex hypothesis space would be a hypothesis space, like the things you're trying to infer, right? The variables, those hidden variables. Like, what's the most complicated random variable? It's a program. Because programs can do anything, right? What if we could infer Turing, a program in some Turing-complete language? And around that time, Avi Pfeffer and Norman Ramsey, there were a lot of publications around that time, exploring this idea. Here's a really interesting one that tried to connect two fields: probabilistic modeling and this machine learning statistics on the one hand, and programming languages, or like computability on the other hand. Right? These two really different fields, and it was exciting to see this paper. It was talking about this lambda calculus. Back in 2002, I'd never heard of this thing, and it was this mysterious concept from computer science. So here's a funny story. I was traveling to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and visiting a friend. I was walking through a bookstore, and I came upon this math book by the Dutch logician Henk Barendrecht on the lambda calculus. And it was like the lambda calculus. I don't know if you've ever heard of the lambda calculus, but if you've never heard of it, it sounds like some imposing thing. I didn't really know what it was. I was looking, reading this book, standing around literally in the bookstore reading this book, and thinking like, oh, what the heck do all these symbols mean? But puzzling through it, it turns out this is a weird looking formula here. What does it mean? It turns out this is just, it's just like this lambda here, it's just like the same lambda that we use in Python, right? When we write an inline function, it's just a lambda there. And the parentheses are kind of in the wrong place for Python, but if you move the parentheses over, all this is saying is you're applying a lambda function to some argument n, and then the computer in that triangle arrow thing is executing that. And what do you get? You get the function body m with something substituted in. And what looked like, at first, this arcane language turned out to be, it's just a programming language, right? And back then, I was a programmer, I thought, hey, I can do programming languages. It turns out this is just a programming language. This is actually the first functional programming language invented in 1931 by Alonzo Church. This is like before computers were around. This is this lambda calculus. And I thought, hey, this is exactly what we need, right? We need something like lambda calculus instead of random variables, right? We need to infer things about probabilistic programs, or we need to infer things about programs. So Henk Barendrecht, the author here, had pasted, continuing this funny story, Henk Barendrecht had pasted some photos of the researchers in the sections in this book I was reading. And I was so excited, I went and contacted some of these researchers, and ended up doing my PhD, spending 4 years working with this Rich Statman, and extending some research by Dana Scott, just out of this book, just to learn more about the lambda calculus. I'd studied all this probability, but it's really difficult to, it was really difficult to deal with these, Turing-complete kind of hypothesis spaces. And so I figured, why don't I just spend a few years doing that? And then when I was in grad school, a lot of other people were thinking the same thing. They were thinking, like, why don't we combine probabilistic modeling with programming languages? So in 2005, this really exciting paper came out from two groups. Frank Fenning, who is a programming language researcher at Carnegie Mellon. I was actually teaching a class of his. And Sebastian Thrun, who's a roboticist, right? The programming languages and robotics and machine learning and kind of data science fusing into this single paper. And it was really exciting. They were building a probabilistic modeling language, kind of like the graphical models we saw, but it was expressed in OCaml, functional programming language, and they were doing inference over these OCaml programs. And they actually built this into a robot that was I think it was doing localization. It was like a real world problem. And then a few years later, Josh Tenenbaum's lab at MIT published this paper on church, which was like the dream. It was a Turing complete programming language where you could infer programs given their outputs. So it was really exciting. And Noah Goodman, the first author of this paper around this time, coined this phrase, probabilistic programming language, that really merged these two fields. So let me go back into detail. I've been talking about history a little bit, but let's talk about what does this mean, this probabilistic programming language concept. So remember, we have these two ways of viewing a probabilistic model. This is just a really simple probabilistic model, but remember there's the math view, and then there's the graphical model view. And then this new vision of representing models as programs exactly embeds these models in a programming language. Okay, so this is like a Python function. This is pseudocode. There are a lot of probabilistic programming systems out there, and none of them look exactly like this, but this is pseudocode for what a model might look like in a probabilistic programming language. And this is great because like these weird concepts of like, you know, statisticians will write IID for independent identically distributed variables, and you know, they draw those as a box, as a plate diagram. Well, now we can represent that as a for loop, and everyone knows what a for loop is. It's just so much more tangible. Not only that, but we can represent, you know, this for loop could have a length that's a random variable. That means we can deal with open world problems. We can have dynamic structure. Anything you can do in a programming language, you know, if you know conditional statements or recursion, we can now represent those as distributions over program executions. So it really represented the this full vision of being able to infer over complex, you know, unknown dimensional spaces, not just Euclidean space that, you know, statisticians had dealt with in the 20th century. So let's look at this model code just in a little more detail. This model code has some latent variables and some observed variables. The latent variables, we're going to represent those as samples using a sample primitive. And this isn't quite a function. It's better to think of this as like a keyword or a special, like a new special kind of control flow construct, as like extending into a new language. And similarly, the observations, the likelihood here, we can introduce those as like a new keyword, an observed keyword. And again, it's better to think of these as two kind of magical primitives that we're extending the language with, okay? In Python is so dynamic that you can do anything in Python, and in fact, in practice, we can represent these with functions, but they have special meaning, and I think it's clear to think of them as an extension of the language. But that's not all you need to represent a probabilistic program, one of these probabilistic models. You need something else that's a little more subtle, and that's some sort of inference runtime. You can't run these models like scripts. Like when we run Python functions, right? We run them in the Python runtime, and they execute, right? You can't do that with probabilistic programs. You can't use this standard Python runtime, and that's why it's a really different concept. That's why we call it a probabilistic programming language. It's not just like a library. It's an entire new programming language with its own runtime. And this runtime, here I call it infer posterior, but that's just made up. It's the idea of the runtime, though, is that it's a solver. It's an inference algorithm. It's a machine learning algorithm. And this is a really subtle concept, so I want to try to make an analogy with something else you might be familiar with. So you remember back in studying math, you studied, you know, at some point you studied arithmetic. You learned to, you know, add numbers and subtract numbers and multiply numbers and divide numbers. And in arithmetic, you're given some numbers and an expression, and you evaluate it forward, right? And you end up, what do you end up at the end with? You end up with a number, okay? Later on, you studied algebra, okay? And in algebra, it was a little bit different. In algebra, you're given an equation or a group of equations, and you don't execute the equations, right? You have to reason backwards. The equations have unknowns in them, okay? And when when you're being an algebraist, you have to think about what could this have been? What could these missing variables have been, right? And you use inference machinery like the quadratic formula. You can think of that as an algorithm, right? You have an equation, you have this algorithm that's like the quadratic formula, and it says, here's what the missing variable could have been. And sometimes there are two answers, there could be multiple answers though. But the point is, in algebra, you're not running things forward, you're running them, you're kind of inferring what could have happened, okay? Running them kind of backwards. Let's think it back in terms of probabilistic programming. When we can think of scripting, typical, data processing, we all write data processing scripts. You can think of that as kind of like arithmetic. You're running something forward, you're running a script forward, and you end up with some data at the end. But when we write a probabilistic program, it's closer to algebra. Here we have, it's kind of we have kind of an equation, right? And what we want is to solve for this mu and sigma, okay? And this inference algorithm, it's not quite the quadratic formula, but it's something similar. It's like a technique we can use to figure out what those hidden variables could have been, okay? And typically, the way these inference algorithms work is they return some distribution, because it's not like algebra where there's a single solution or a set of solutions. Here we're in statistics land, right? Probability land, and here we want to think about probability distributions over things. So the solution to our algebra equation here is a distribution over the mu and sigma. Okay? And these inference runtimes, the result, notice there's no return statement in this model, right? We're not like running forward and getting something out. We're solving this model for what the mu and sigma could have been. And the solution is a posterior distribution, a distribution over what the values could have been. A lot of inference runtimes simply return a set of samples. It's difficult, like there's no universal representation for a probability distribution over multiple random variables. Like maybe it's a multivariate normal, but maybe it's not, maybe it's some weird distribution. But you can always draw samples from it, and that's like a kind of a universal interchange format. So a lot of these inference algorithms will return a set of like 100 samples or 1,000 samples. You can do whatever you want with those. You can compute their mean or their median or some quantiles and get confidence intervals or credible intervals. But it's a nice kind of output. So whereas a script might output like a file or some number, inference algorithms often return a set of samples. Okay, so far we've seen that these probabilistic programs are kind of a new way of, they're different from just normal Python. It's kind of a new way of running programs, okay? And you may have heard of Conway's law. Conway's law says that software code bases grow to reflect their, the organizations that create them. I think that's often true. I see, even the company I work for, I see code bases where it's clear that two people don't talk to each other because there are code bases that don't talk to each other. Here, we've organized our code into two distinct kind of areas, right? There's models and there's some low-level inference algorithms, okay? And this allows a particular kind of organizational structure, okay? These models should be easy to read, and they capture facts about the world. And so kind of everybody should be looking at these things. Scientists should be looking at them, domain experts should be looking at those, right? Whereas these inference algorithms, they're kind of, they take a lot of work, but they're kind of easy. It's clear what's correct, and it's clear they need to be fast, right? You can just put some engineers on that. Hey, here's some unit tests. Make sure that, here's some benchmarking suites. Go do it. And you can go, hang out in your dark room and just code these for hours and hours. You don't really need to talk to anyone, right? So it's a nice way, like organizationally, of factoring code into code that everyone needs to look at, and code that you can go off in a corner and just like get it right. It's clear what's correct. So I really like this factorization of code. So after grad school, I was really sold on this idea, this idea of probabilistic programming. After grad school, I ended up joining another aircraft tracking company, and my job talk there was like, hey, probabilistic models are great, but probabilistic programming is the future. It was clear that this was where things were going. And I ended up working around for a few different companies, some startups, some big companies working on machine learning platforms at some big companies. But you know, over the years, I never really productionized a probabilistic programming system. It was, you know, this dream, and it remained a dream, I think, for a lot of years. A long time later, I met this guy, Perry DeVelpine. Sorry, these names aren't legible. Perry DeVelpine, who's an entomology professor, like an ecologist at UC Berkeley. And he, you know, in industry, it was really tough to find people who believed in this separation of models and inference, right, as an ideology. You know, in industry, you got to get things done, and it's tough to get things done when you're bound to an ideology. But it's also nice to follow an ideology, and I ended up joining Perry DeVelpine's group there to work on his probabilistic modeling system. It's called Readable, and it has a very clean front end. It's an R. It's an R library with a C++ backend, and the R front end is very clean, and the C++ backend is very fast, and not very clean. But no one has to look at it because it's fast, and there's some tests, and it's a really beautiful factorization of code. One issue, though, with the system is the type of the particular inference algorithm we were using, and that's Markov chain Monte Carlo. And Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithms are pretty slow, and especially they don't scale with dimension. At the time, this is 2017, and so 2015 TensorFlow had been released and provided a really nice GPU framework. And so we had this idea of this project where we would integrate TensorFlow, you know, try to use TensorFlow and the GPU computations to speed up this Nimble programming language. And so we spent a few months on that, and it was pretty crazy. We had you know, TensorFlow's in Python, R was in R Nimble's in R, and so we had this like R code talking to Python code, talking to C++ code, and then we had a C++ backend that would directly talk to TensorFlow's C++ backend, and it was quite a mess and wasn't super fast. But then I heard through a friend that Zubin Garmani and Noah Goodman at Uber were building a probabilistic programming language from scratch. PyTorch had just been released. This is 2017, I think. Earlier that year, PyTorch had just been released by Facebook. And Noah Goodman, who's that same first author who coined the phrase probabilistic programming language, he was working on a new probabilistic programming language that's built on PyTorch. Okay, and so this sounded great. You know, we had these slow inference algorithms, but these fast new deep learning libraries. Why don't we build something from scratch? So I ended up joining Noah's group to build this Pyro probabilistic programming language, and I led development on that. But let me try to explain in a little more detail why this was a really exciting idea to combine probabilistic programming languages with these deep learning frameworks. Okay. So at this point, neural networks had been around for a long time. Right? Jeff Hinton had been working on those since the early 80s, I think. And they didn't really have huge success until the early 2000s, right? And I think there were some new architectures, but a lot of the success was due to things that weren't really specific to neural networks at all. So like Jeff Hinton and Jan LeCun adopted these great engineering practices. Like they made all their neural networks run on GPUs, and GPUs were, you know, they had a lot of compute power, and they were shaped pretty well for neural networks, which meant that these neural networks could train on many more parameters. They used stochastic optimization algorithms like stochastic gradient descent, and these algorithms permitted mini batching. So previously, a lot of algorithms would have to train on the entire data set every epoch, like every step. But in, these mini batch algorithms allowed you to have, you know, unboundedly much data because you only needed to look at just a little bit of data every step. Automatic differentiation libraries were becoming easier to use. Automatic differentiation had been around for a long time. There were Fortran AD algorithms, but they were libraries, but they were difficult to use. And in the, I don't know, around this time, the 2010s, these automatic differentiation algorithms were becoming easier to use and saving people time. I think early in my career, I spent months, you know, hand deriving gradients. A lot of machine learning researchers would hand derive gradients, and it just, you know, it's a waste of time. You know, it's awful to hand derive gradients when you could instead use a library. So that saved people a lot of time, and it meant that their design cycles could be shorter, and they ended up with better results. And finally, something that's not often talked about is like the advance of software engineering and these libraries really coming together, like TensorFlow, really having good software engineering practices, good tests and documentation, good open source practices, and that really led to some advancements. Meanwhile, probabilistic programming as a field was still kind of languishing. There were some people applying MCMC, putting MCMC algorithms on GPUs, but it really hadn't caught up in terms of its parallel progress to deep learning. But around the mid-2010s, there were some interesting papers that showed how these deep learning approaches could be applied to probabilistic programming. And probably the most exciting paper was Diederik Kingma and Max Welling's paper introducing variational autoencoders, VAEs. You may have heard of VAEs. Before I talk about VAEs, let me explain what an autoencoder is, though. So an autoencoder is just a particular architecture for a neural network. It consists of an encoder, that's the green thing, is the encoder that takes like an image, for example, and encodes it into an embedding, okay, like a low-dimensional embedding vector. And then the blue thing is a neural network that decodes that back into an image. Okay, the idea is that we want to do dimensionality reduction. We train one of these neural networks, we train both of those neural networks at once, such that the reconstruction, we train it on reconstruction loss to make sure that we can compress something and decompress it, and the reconstructed thing is accurate, okay? And these have been around for a while by this time. So Kingma and Welling's insight was that if you squint and add a little bit of noise to this autoencoder, it actually looks like a probabilistic model, and you can train it using a variational loss. That's why then they call this a variational autoencoder. That was really exciting because the variational perspective turned this, what looked like just a neural network, into a probabilistic model, okay? Here often probabilistic model, probabilistic programming language land, we had been looking around for really fast inference algorithms, and here's a way of looking at an algorithm, the deep learning autoencoder algorithm, tweaking things a little bit, and then it allowed us to import that algorithm idea into the land of probabilistic modeling. In fact, we could split up this autoencoder, this variational autoencoder, into two parts: the decoder and the encoder, and we can think of these two parts as a generative model and an inference model, which is kind of part of the inference algorithm. So a few researchers at that time realized, in the probabilistic programming field, realized that this VAE pattern, the variational autoencoder idea, might be used to define more general models. Like, what if we replaced those encoder network and decoder network with structured things like probabilistic models, right, or probabilistic programs? So here's this recipe. I don't want to get too much into the details of the recipe, but the idea is that Kingma and Welling had imported this recipe, from deep learning that could be reused across models. They didn't. This training regimen for variational autoencoders didn't depend on the network architecture at all, right? You can plug in any sort of network architecture for those encoder and decoder. In fact, you could plug in structured things, and this didn't. This training algorithm didn't change at all, and that was exciting for people like David Bly and Justin Trian and Noah Goodman, because that meant they could implement it once in a library and then build a really flexible front end for defining these models, these components that we want to train. So just one more area of looking at that is that the decoder network here can be thought of as a probabilistic model, and the encoder network can be thought of as part of an inference algorithm. So when we implemented this This is the whole idea behind Pyro, the Pyro probabilistic programming language, and Edward, which is Dustin Tran's probabilistic programming language. The whole idea is to use this VAE-like training approach to fit probabilistic models and perform inference, and it scales way better than these old MCMC algorithms scaled. Also, this one requirement here is that you actually need to write that inference model, and so some of the work we did in Pyro was to automate that part, so that all you need to do is really pay attention to this modeling front end. So that's what we built into Pyro, this probabilistic programming language out of Uber AI Labs. We open sourced this in 2017, and it got way more attraction and contribution than we expected. It was adopted by the Linux Foundation in 2019. And it was interesting to see some of the follow-up papers, people who built on top of this. Remember, there's this kind of separation between modeling and inference. And we really saw that the people who were building on top of this, some of them were like the inference engineer, inference researcher kind of people, and they would write machine learning methods papers. And then there were a lot of people who just used Pyro on the modeling side and would import our standard inference algorithms and just build science on top of this. So for the rest of this talk, I'd just like to talk about some particular applications that people have built on top of Pyro. So actually, one of the really surprising things, we were using Pyro, here, let me back up for a minute. So inside Uber, we were using Pyro for a few different things. We were using it for some causal inference, for some time series forecasting, and for some data fusion. We had a maps project at one point that was like a competitor to Google Maps, and we were fusing all sorts of different data in this maps project. And these Bayesian models are really scalable and good for data fusion. One really surprising thing for us, though, was how many of these people who were using Pyro were actually in the biosciences and genetics. So unbeknownst to us, there was this explosion of genetics research. I come from more of like a math and computer science background, and I was really excited, like many of you may have been, about like Moore's Law, because if you study computer science, then 3 years from now you'll get 4 times as much compute power, right? Everything is growing, right? In computer science, it's growing by this well-known Moore's Law. It turns out genetic sequencing technology is growing faster than Moore's Law. It's a super exciting field, and all of the applications I'm going to tell you about are in genetics and biology. So this is some research. This is not my research at all. This is research by Vitaly Kleshchevnikov and some other people who were using Pyro on single-cell RNA sequencing analysis. So this is a transcriptomics project where they're trying to infer where cells are located in tissue, and they're doing this by individually sequencing every cell. So maybe back 20 years ago, it was a feat to sequence a genome. Okay, these days you can sequence every cell. You can sequence tens of thousands of cells, each cell in a large-scale sequencing experiment, and it leads to this huge profusion of data that's really difficult to analyze with classical statistics. But these scalable variational inference methods ended up being really good for these approaches. Vitaly built this research on top of Pyro, and he ended up contributing some great code back to the Pyro system that is available for everyone now. Another application we saw was by Miratash Babadi, who's a researcher at the Broad Institute in Cambridge. And this research tried to distinguish, he built this probabilistic model. This is like one of those graphical models. Here's a picture of his graphical model that he built with this project. And he was trying to distinguish in a large experiment RNA sequences that came from cells versus RNA sequences that came from junk that was floating around in a solution. And he was using variational inference for this. I'm not going to get into any details here, but Miratash was also really excited about building these scalable variational inference algorithms and analyzing lots of data. And he actually, we met, my team met Mertash at a probabilistic programming conference, and he was so compelling in his tales of you know, this steeper than Moore's law growth of the field that a few of us ended up joining Mertash. We ended up moving to the Broad Institute to work with Mertash and work on genetics problems. And so now I work in the field of biology. And the next, okay, and the final application I want to tell you about is in more detail. I'll go into some actual details here rather than just glossing over. So Mark Miankowiak and I were some of the Pyro team at Uber, and we, after having met Mertash, we joined the Broad Institute. This was during 2020, during the first months of the pandemic. And the pandemic at that time was on everybody's mind. And so we decided to, you know, we had this great opportunity to work with world-class epidemiologists and virologists, including Pardis Sabeti's lab at Harvard and Jeremy Lupin's lab at University of Massachusetts. So here we worked on a project on SARS-CoV-2 sequencing and forecasting. So let me go into the details of this project. A lot of people have been looking at the genomics of SARS-CoV-2. So one thing that was different in this pandemic than any other pandemic is that people were sequencing the virus, okay? We have millions now of genetic sequences of different virus particles, complete genomes of these particles. Here's a phylogenetic tree, and each leaf on this phylogenetic tree is a SARS-CoV-2 sample that's been completely genetically sequenced. Up until this point, the phylogenetic analysis tools, which are most of them are Bayesian and very probabilistic, these phylogenetic analysis tools have been able to handle maybe 10,000 sequences. They could scale up to 10,000 sequences, and that was a lot of sequences in 2015. 10,000, like no one had more than 10,000 sequences of anything, you know, any of these viruses, right? During the pandemic, though, we had this, you know, again, faster than Moore's law growth of data. When we started this project, there were 70,000. I think we started looking at 70,000 sequences, and so we were thinking, oh, why don't we just write some, you know, faster phylogenetic analysis tools? We'll just scale up to 100,000 instead of 70,000, right? Or instead of 10,000, which was like the scale of the original tools. And even while we were doing this, you know, it's like we were being inundated in the water, you know, we're up to our neck in data. 6 months into this project, there were like millions of samples, and even our early efforts were failing to look at trees, like these phylogenetic trees. So we stepped back and thought, hey, we really need a scalable method here. So instead we looked at aggregate statistics. And so the aggregate statistics, instead of that fancy tree, you know, that has very fine resolution, we decided to just look at aggregate statistics. The aggregate statistics we wanted to look at were the relative strain proportions. And I'll use the word strain as the same as variant or lineage. It's just like a group of SARS-CoV-2. You've probably heard of Delta or Omicron or Alpha or B117 or all these different names. We can think of those as different kinds of SARS-CoV-2. Okay? And over time, there's been different portions in any population, right? So this is what we tried to model. And the way we wanted to model this was with just a simple regression model, a logistic growth regression model, fitting sigmoid curves to our observed data. Okay, and sigmoid curves are nice because they sum to one. One way of looking at a sigmoid curve is as a multiple linear regression. You fit two lines and then map those through a softmax function. Okay, that's, you know, the softmax is, 1 over 1 plus e to the negative something. This isn't the only way to define a logistic growth curve, but this is a nice way to, this defining it in terms of softmax is nice because it very easily generalizes to multivariate logistic growth. Okay, so we can think of a multivariate logistic function as having multiple lines. And like, hey, we can all do linear regression. All we need to do is linear regression, then map it through a softmax function. And then we get out, we can look at this, we can look at this in two different ways. We can look at like each of the individual concentrations, or we can look at that stack plot, like we saw in a couple slides back, the stack plot of the different proportions. So we fit one of these multivariate, multiple strain logistic growth curves to a little bit of data. We just look at England's data during the early kind of thing. England has great geneticists and great genetic sequencing infrastructure, and they, since the very beginning of the pandemic, had collected a lot of data, and so we could use them as like a test region. And we fit a multivariate logistic curve to their data, and it looks like it's a beautiful fit, right? Each of these curves has only 2 parameters, right? They're then mapped through the softmax function, but it's like for a 2-parameter curve, that's a pretty good fit. We were really excited about that. But we had, England is just one of the locations around the world. These genetic sequences were being collected around the world, and there was a world's full of data. A lot of people at the time had been using, already using these logistic growth curves, but they've been looking at like 1 or 2 strains at a time, and they'd be looking at their local city or their local country. But we decided, why don't we model all of the data? Why don't we just look at everything? Most people weren't looking at everything because there were no tools to look at everything. So we thought, how can we look at everything? So we decided, why don't we just put all of the data into a cube? We'll have a cube that has all of the regions and all of the time spans. Like we'll bin it into week, and we'll have all of the strains. We'll split up that phylogenetic tree into 1,000 or 1,500 different strains or variants, right? This is a huge cube. This is, or rectangle, or whatever you call it. It has like 200 million, I think this is like 200 million different buckets, but it's sparse, so it's actually pretty cheap. We can actually represent this on the GPU pretty cheaply. And to model this, we built just one of these multi-level regression models, like a hierarchical Bayesian model. There's actually no like dynamic control flow here. It's just like a pretty vanilla probabilistic graphical model. The thing is, we can run it on enormous data. There's 500,000 hidden variables here inside these plates. Here, remember we saw those plate diagrams earlier in the talk? Here there's overlapping plates, and that's like nested for loops. And every time you have a nested for loop, you have like quadratic growth of the things inside there, right? So each of these S plate and the P plate are pretty big. They have like 1,000 things in them. So we ended up with 500,000 hidden variables, and that's a lot of hidden variables there. And we built a joint model to infer these things. But this ran on our deep probabilistic programming framework on a GPU, and we could perform inference in about 10 minutes, which was amazing. But the first time we performed inference, we got garbage, and the 10th time we performed inference, we got garbage. But maybe by the 15th time, tweaking the model, filtering the data, we got some pretty good results. The only way we could get to the 50th time of training this model, though, is by having a model that trained really quickly, right? We need a lot of iteration. Another really cool thing about this model was that we really did follow, this ideology of having modeling and inference code. The model was really clean and had this really short code, right? Now, don't misunderstand me. There was tons of gross code in this project. You can go look at the repo. There's tons of gross data munging code, thousands of lines of data munging code, thousands of lines of evaluation and validation code. But no one really needs to look at that. Maybe you get a little bit of code review on some of that. What people really need to pay attention to when we had these big Zoom meetings with a dozen scientists all looking at a model, they're looking at just a tiny bit of code, and there's a lot of opinions in those Zoom meetings, and there's a lot of arguments, and people saying like, this doesn't seem quite right, and I don't think this is, this makes physical sense, and I'm just a kind of a machine learning researcher. I don't know how these things are supposed to work. But it was really great to have all these epidemiologists and virologists in on the call and really focusing their attention on the things that are scientifically important. On one of those calls, Jacob Lemieux, this epidemiologist at Mass General Hospital, had this brilliant idea of making a slight change to this model. So originally we'd been doing some forecasting. We were forecasting forward and seeing like what are the strain proportions. He thought like, hey, what if we change the model a little bit and regress against the mutations? We now have the genetic sequences. What if we try to fit these growth rates against the mutations that we observe? It's a slight change to the model. Like, look at this, three or four lines have changed. It's a slight change. but it's like a totally different model. We used to, we started out, we set out to do time series forecasting, and we ended up with what's called a genome-wide association study, which is a totally different kind of result. So let me try to explain this picture. I only have a few minutes left, but let me try to explain this picture. So this is the final result of a genome-wide association study. It's called the Manhattan plot, because sometimes it looks like a Manhattan skyline. Along the x-axis, we have the SARS-CoV genome. It's about 30,000 nucleotides long, okay? Each of the dots is a mutation that's been observed in the wild. Along the y-axis, we plot each dot. The height at which we plot each dot, each mutation, is our model's prediction for how much that mutation increases the fitness of SARS-CoV-2, okay? How can we do that? We regress the slope, the fitness, right? On those logistic curves, the slope is like the fitness. If we have two strains of SARS-CoV-2 and they have different slopes, the difference in those slopes is like the relative fitness, okay? If we regress those numbers against mutation, we can see which parts of the genome are evolving, right? I never would have thought about this, it was only because Jacob Lemieux had this brilliant idea that we could get to this point. But the results ended up being very, very credible. A lot of the fitness increasing genes, mutations occurred in the spike gene. There were some surprises where there are these non-structured proteins that seem to be increasing fitness, and people hadn't been studying this. Almost everyone was focusing on the spike gene. And the most surprising thing was that there was this super high spike in the nucleocapsid protein in one really tiny region of the nucleocapsid protein, right? This is a totally, surprising scientific result. And it was actually just after we published our preprint, this was corroborated by Jennifer Doudna's team. They did some wet lab experiments to do this. I'll end there, but I just want to say that was a really fun project that I got to do with Party Subedi's lab and Jacob Lemieux, and it really showed how this ideology of having common code that this declarative model could lead to a really great collaboration. And I continue to collaborate with people. I work at this protein startup, Generate Biomedicines, and I continue to collaborate with scientists that are using this paradigm. And the world is, I guess as a final note, the world is great. What a great time to be alive. There's so many probabilistic programming libraries available now. There's plenty of literature out there if you're interested in reading about these. Thanks. Any questions?
Maybe I should ask a question. First of all, thank you for your interesting speech. So it's interesting to hear your insight of how do you see, how will the probabilistic programming field develop further in the future, and what further applications it will have?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say right now it's really easy to work with these kind of old school probabilistic graphical models. And especially if they have continuous random variables, that's kind of a solved problem. We can do that like in this last application. It's a little more difficult if you have, say, discrete random variables in the middle of your model. That makes inference a little more difficult if there's dynamic structure. So remember, there's this vision of inferring the world as represented by a program in some Turing-complete language. We're not there. What we can do is construct like a smaller hypothesis space, a limited set of programs, and maybe some programs that have fixed structure and a few parameters, especially continuous parameters, and we can solve that, right? It's more difficult if there's dynamic program structure. It's more difficult if there are discrete random variables, and there's some techniques, but it still takes a lot of work to get that to work. I think in the future, it would really be great if we could expand the class of programs that can serve as our kind of random variables. You know, if we think of random variable as program, it would be great if we could say, think of a Python program of 100 lines, right? That's all you know. There's a 100-line Python program, and that's your random variable. Figure it out what it is, right? That's like the dream. We're definitely not there, but we can inch towards it, and I think we'll slowly inch towards that in the future. As for applications, I really think biology is a really exciting field. There's amazing new experimental assays being developed. So these probabilistic models are really great at handling noisy data, sparse data, extremely noisy data, large amounts of it. And I think some of the most exciting work right now is in new experimental assays in biology. That's the field I've chosen to join and make progress in. And I think that'll be a place where there are a lot of new applications for these scalable inference algorithms.
Thank you.
Yes?
Can you please tell, what do you think about connections between probabilistic programming languages and quantum computing?
The connections between probabilistic programming languages and quantum computing. I've heard that quantum computing can speed up a lot of computations. It might be that quantum computing could speed up some of the computations that occur in probabilistic programming. I think it remains to be seen. I think it remains to be seen how that will work out. I'm interested in probabilistic, quantum computing also because a lot of the questions we ask at Generative Biomedicines are about how things that are actually quantum behave. And so, there's this idea of general quantum computing, but even specifically, quantum computing to simulate quantum systems might be more exciting than quantum computing to simulate things that, maybe you could run on a cluster. So, I don't know how to answer that. Thanks.
Sorry, I have a question.
There's a question.
Yeah, maybe then I can start. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for the nice presentation and the speech. And I have a question concerning the models. You said that you were able to see how what part of the genome was evolving. How it ended up in the end. So, were you able to? I mean, this paper was it able to predict which mutations evolved in the end in real life? So, I mean, for the last several months, for example.
So it couldn't. This research could predict among mutations that have been observed how they have affected. It was very much retrospective research. How they have affected growth rate. We had no model of like a predictive model of how novel mutations might in the future affect growth rate. That would be the domain of something that maybe had molecular models, molecular simulations, and other people are building models like that. And there's some interesting work out of Debbie Marx's lab at Harvard about looking at not just SARS-CoV-2 but all sarbecoviruses and trying to use statistics there to determine what new novel mutations might affect growth rate. I think the most interesting result of this research wasn't even the individual mutations, but isolating regions of the genome where we're seeing rapid evolution. And those are reasons that regions where researchers might in the future want to spend more effort on doing experiments. There was a question in the middle. Do you want to just say your question? Oh, here.
Yeah, well, the microphone was gave to me, so yeah. Thank you for the presentation, it was really great. And my question a bit provocative, so sorry beforehand. So why probabilistic programming and not neural networks? Or in other words, could you please provide some pros and cons?
Why not both? I'm working on a model, right now with some colleagues where we have a probabilistic program that's very interpretable, And in the middle of that, we squash a neural network, which isn't quite interpretable, but it fits the data really well. Like you don't need to choose. Our PPL is built, Pyro is built on top of PyTorch, and you can put Pyro models inside your PyTorch models, and you can put PyTorch models inside your Pyro models. One reason to choose, you could do both, but one reason to choose a probabilistic model is in particular because those latent variables are interpretable. And there's a lot of work trying to interpret the innards of neural networks, but in probabilistic programming, we start with interpretability, right? Everything is interpretable from the outset. There's no ambiguity. You know what, that 500,000 variables we had in the middle of our growth model, every one of those is completely interpretable. So I guess if you want things to be interpretable, you could even select in a large model, you could even select the things you want to be interpretable and use probabilistic programming for that. And the things you don't really care about, you just want really good accuracy, you can have that be black box neural layers.
Okay, thank you very much.
But sorry, you have a question in the middle, and I'm sorry you keep getting delayed.
Well, thank you first for the talk.
Oh, here comes the microphone.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the talk. It was really interesting. And I actually had pretty much the same question because I recall from in the past I used RNimble and saw that there was a lot of friction in people adopting probabilistic models because of the computational expense. And it seems that there's been a way to overcome a lot of this and not require the use of Monte Carlo sampling, for example. But then it seems that still there's quite a bit of friction, that people are not so willing to adopt probabilistic modeling. And so you said that we can do both, but where do you think the friction still remains? Is it in selecting prior distributions, for example? Is it in people trusting these models? Like, why isn't everybody using probabilistic modeling?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you partly answered the question in that it used to be that inference was very slow. MCMC can be very slow. There's progress being made in MCMC. But I tend to use variational inference, stochastic variational inference, stochastic gradient variational inference, and that's very fast. It's not as accurate as MC, but it's much faster. It scales much better, and I find that given a choice between high accuracy inference that's slow or slightly lower accuracy inference that's fast, it's better to use fast, cheap inference, because then you can iterate on your model. You can train a model and realize, look, I could have done perfect inference on the wrong model, but if I do pretty good inference, I can see that the model's wrong, and I can change the model. And I think that kind of workflow of using faster, slightly less accurate inference, and then really iterating quickly on the model is I think that'll help people use probabilistic models more. Another answer to your question, though, is I think really in terms of interpretability. The places where I most see probabilistic models being used are where people really want to interpret everything about the model. When there are 5 scientists in on a call, if there are 5 scientists in on a call, they want to argue about what's semantically correct, and if they have a semantically meaningful model that they can argue about, we can come to consensus about what the right model is. That's really difficult to do with a black box machine learning model, right? You can't argue about what the architecture needs to be. You need to do architecture search, and then you can do cross-validation experiments. But there's nothing really for scientists to argue about, right? There's no room for years of expertise to be baked into those priors, right? And I work with a lot of scientists, and there's a huge amount of knowledge that they have, and it's difficult to bake that knowledge into a deep learning model, whereas it's much easier to bake those in as priors to take advantage of the experts, if we have the opportunity to collaborate with experts.
Thank
Thank you for the interesting talk. You probably already answered my question in your prior answer, but what I want to ask you is, what are the pros and cons within the approach you applied at MCMC?
So the pros and cons and
Pros and cons between the approach you applied, the variational approach, and the MCMC approach.
Yeah, I guess. So I often use variational inference, which is a very fast but approximate inference method. If you can, it's more accurate. If you have the time, it's more accurate to use MCMC because it generally Markov chain Markov because it generally provides more accurate answers. Along with Pyro, so in Pyro we usually use variational inference, but there's there's like a sister project called NumPyro, which is based on Google's JAX backend, and JAX does some really smart program analysis to make MCMC very fast in JAX, and so a lot of people actually use MCMC and NumPyro for small models. Sometimes one cool thing about probabilistic programming is that you can write the model and then apply different inference algorithms to it, right? You can have one piece of code that's the model, and I often do that. Even in that SARS-CoV-2 project, I started out with a model, and then a variational inference method, and an MCMC inference method. And the variational inference method took like 10 to 15 minutes at first, and the MCMC method took 5 hours. And it was a little bit more accurate, but the model was wrong, and so I don't know. I still feel like that there's more to be gained in finding a better model than there is to be having doing perfect inference.